In 1974, Schlitz Brewing Company was producing more than 17 million barrels of beer a year. It was the second largest brewery in the United States, worth roughly $3 billion, and its name was stitched into the fabric of American working-class life the way a union card was not glamorous but permanent. By 1982, it was gone, not struggling, not restructuring, gone. What happened in between is not a story about market forces or foreign competition or a generational shift in taste. It is a story about a company that knowingly changed its own product to save money, convinced itself that no one would notice, and then watched on camera as people noticed. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to Milwaukee, to the river, to the 19th century when German immigrant August Krug opened a small restaurant and began brewing a beer to serve alongside the food. When Krug died in 1856, his bookkeeper, a man named Joseph Schlitz, married the widow, took over the business, and put his name on the label. The beer, now Joseph Schlitz Brewing, survived Milwaukee's Great Fire of 1871 partly because Schlitz donated barrels of beer to the thirsty, displaced population. The city drank it. The city remembered. Market share followed gratitude, and the company's tagline, "The beer that made Milwaukee famous," was not a marketing invention. It was a historical claim that happened to be true. Through the early 20th century, Schlitz was one of the great American brewing dynasties. It survived prohibition by pivoting to malt extract and chocolate syrup, which is either resourceful or a form of institutional trauma, depending on how you look at it. After repeal, it came roaring back. By 1902, it had already briefly held the title of the best-selling beer in America. By the post-war boom, it was competing neck and neck with Anheuser-Busch for the top spot and losing only by the narrowest margin. In 1970, Schlitz held approximately 12% of the American beer market. Budweiser held 14%. The gap was real but closable, and the people running Schlitz knew it. That knowledge is what made the decision of 1973 feel, to the people inside the building, not like a gamble, but like strategy. The man at the center of it was Robert Uehlein Jr., the grandson of a Schlitz executive and the company's CEO since 1961. Uehlein was not a reckless man. He was an executive who had grown up inside the company, understood the industry deeply, and was under serious competitive pressure. Anheuser-Busch was spending aggressively on marketing and distribution. The only way to close the gap, Uehlein's team concluded, was to fund a comparable marketing campaign, and the only way to fund it without crushing margins was to cut production costs. The internal logic was clean. Beer is largely water, barley, hops, and yeast. Corn syrup, a cheaper fermentable, could partially replace barley. A new high-temperature fermentation process, called accelerated batch fermentation, could cut brewing time from roughly 3 weeks to less than 4 days, dramatically increasing throughput per barrel of tank capacity. Both changes would save tens of millions of dollars a year. The money would flow into advertising. Advertising would drive volume. Volume would drive market share. Market share would close the gap with Budweiser. The people in that room were not idiots. They ran financial models. They looked at consumer research suggesting that most drinkers couldn't reliably distinguish between beer brands in blind tastings. They believed, with some supporting data, that brand loyalty was largely an emotional construct, that the label mattered more than the liquid, and they made their bet. What the models did not adequately account for was the specific chemistry of what they were doing. The accelerated fermentation process, combined with the new ingredients, produced a beer that was prone to developing a visible flake, a haze that would cloud the bottle and create a cosmetic problem that no amount of advertising could explain away. Schlitz's response was to add a stabilizing agent called Chillguard, which solved the haze problem but reacted with another additive, creating a soft foam that sat at the bottom of the bottle and looked, to the consumer holding it up to a kitchen light in 1975, like something had gone wrong, which it had. By that point, Schlitz was already accelerating. In 1974 and 1975, the reformulated beer entered the market at scale. The cost savings materialized exactly as projected, and for a moment, for a very brief moment, the plan appeared to be working. Volume was up, margins improved, the marketing spend increased. Then the calls started coming in. Not all at once. At first it was isolated complaints, distributors mentioning that returns were up, sales reps reporting that bar owners were switching to Budweiser or Miller. The company monitored it, studied it, attributed it to regional variation, to a bad batch, to noise in the data. Schlitz did not, at that juncture, reverse course. This is worth dwelling on because the window to recover was real. In 1974 and into 1975, the brand had enough equity and enough distribution infrastructure that a reformulation rollback, expensive, embarrassing, but survivable, was still a live option. They did not take it. Part of what held them in place was the same logic that had gotten them there. If consumers couldn't reliably taste the difference in blind tests, why were they complaining? The company's internal answer was that the complaints were psychosomatic, that drinkers were responding to rumors and media coverage rather than the liquid itself. There was enough data to support that interpretation to keep the argument alive inside the building. And so the decision held. Meanwhile, a competitor was moving. Miller Brewing, owned since 1969 by Philip Morris, was pouring cigarette industry money into beer marketing. Miller Lite launched in 1975, and it hit with the force of a cultural event. A beer that could be positioned as both less filling and proof of masculinity. Miller's ad agency understood something that Schlitz's did not, which is that you can change the product radically if you change the story around it in the same moment. Miller changed what light beer meant. Schlitz had changed their flagship beer and told no one. The market share numbers became impossible to interpret charitably. Schlitz had held roughly 12% of the US market in 1970. By 1976, it had dropped to 9. By 1977, 8. Each percentage point represented millions of barrels, millions of dollars, walking out the door and into a competitor's cooler. The crisis became public in a form the company did not anticipate and could not control. In 1976, a television focus group, organized as part of market research, that was either leaked or deliberately used to pressure the company, depending on the account, showed actual Schlitz loyalists tasting the current product for the first time after having been told what had changed. The footage is remarkable in its quiet devastation. These are not outraged consumers performing for the camera. They are genuinely confused. They set the glass down and ask what happened to the beer they had been drinking for 20 years. One participant says something to the effect that it does not taste like Schlitz. He is not wrong, it did not. The company's advertising at this period made the situation almost grotesque in its irony. Schlitz had been running a campaign built around real drinkers defending their beer, passionate testimonials from the kinds of men who would not change their beer any more than they would change their union. The campaign was filmed. The drinkers were authentic, but the product they were defending on camera was the formulation that had existed before 1974. The men in the commercials were vouching for something that was no longer in the bottle. Uehlein died in 1976, and his departure removed the primary architect of the reformulation. The new leadership moved to reverse the changes. In 1977 and 1978, Schlitz attempted to restore something closer to the original formula, a process it described publicly as returning to a more traditional brewing method. But the reversal created its own problem. The production line could not be switched cleanly overnight. For a period, both versions of the beer were in distribution simultaneously, which meant that a consumer could buy a case of Schlitz in one store and a meaningfully different beer at another store 2 blocks away. Quality control, the single thing a food or beverage brand cannot afford to lose, was visibly gone. In 1978, Schlitz made the decision to recall approximately 10 million bottles and cans of beer, one of the largest beer recalls in American history to that point. The financial cost was severe. The reputational cost was irreversible. A recall is an admission. You cannot recall 10 million units and simultaneously maintain the position that nothing is wrong. By 1980, Schlitz's market share had fallen below 4%. The workforce had been cut dramatically. Breweries that had operated for decades were closing. The company's stock, which had traded at $69 a share in 1974, had collapsed to below $5. The gap they had tried to close with Budweiser was now not a gap, but a chasm. Anheuser-Busch had used the period of Schlitz's self-inflicted chaos to cement a dominance it would hold for decades. In 1982, the Stroh Brewing Company of Detroit acquired Schlitz for approximately $600 million, a fraction of the $3 billion value the brand had carried a decade before. The Milwaukee brewery, which had employed thousands and occupied a sprawling complex that was as central to that city as any factory in any industrial American town, closed. The workers cleared out. The equipment was sold or scrapped. The physical plant eventually became a mixed-use development. The Schlitz name survived as a brand, passed through several ownership changes, and is currently licensed to Pabst Brewing Company, which markets it as a retro, nostalgia-driven product at a discount price point. It sells. People buy it because they remember their fathers drinking it, or because the can has a certain vintage credibility. The beer is still called Schlitz. The company that made it is not there to appreciate the irony. What Schlitz's story reveals is not that you should never cut costs, or that product quality always defeats marketing. The history of consumer goods is full of counterexamples. The specific trap Schlitz fell into was the trap of assuming that the thing your customers are loyal to is the brand identity, when in fact it is the product. This seems obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious in the room in 1973 because the available data, blind taste tests, brand recall studies, consumer surveys, all pointed toward brand dominance as the primary driver of loyalty. The data was not wrong. It was incomplete. It did not capture the specific reaction of a habitual consumer who drinks the same beer 4 nights a week and knows, at a cellular level, when something is off. There is a version of this trap operating in nearly every large organization right now. It is the assumption that what customers are paying for is the name, the relationship, the reputation, and that the underlying thing can be quietly optimized without their knowledge. Sometimes that assumption holds. When it fails, it tends to fail completely, because trust, once broken in the specific way Schlitz broke it, by demonstrating that you changed the thing and said nothing, is not recoverable at scale. You cannot apologize your way back from a 10 million unit recall. You cannot explain your way out of footage of your own customers telling you the beer tastes wrong. The beer that made Milwaukee famous ended up making Milwaukee famous for something else entirely. A case study taught in business schools about what happens when an organization loses track of the difference between what it sells and what people are actually buying. That distinction, small, precise, easy to miss in a spreadsheet, cost $3 billion and 3,000 jobs, and it took exactly 36 months to become permanent.